Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the Aspen Institute. My name is Nick Burns. I'm director of the Aspen Strategy Group. It's a pleasure to see everybody. I know that many of you have been here. We were here last Friday when we had a panel on development and national security. I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd of people who were here on Saturday evening as we honored our friend, mentor, leader, General Brent Scowcroft, with the Public Service Award. And we are an organization founded by Brent Scowcroft and Joe Nye, who is also here this evening, and Bill Perry and others 30 years ago, to be a nonpartisan organization that united independents, Republicans, Democrats in common cause to think about and discuss our national security, how to protect the country, how to have a coherent and successful foreign and defense policy. And we're in our 30th year, and we've just spent the last 5 days here in Aspen discussing the cyber threats and some of the opportunities that arise from that new challenge in a new domain. But tonight we wanted to have another public forum before we close up shop tomorrow morning to talk about the fact that in about a month we're going to be commemorating a tragic day in American history, September 11th, 2001. Everybody in this audience remembers where they were on September 11th, 2001. And we have, I think, 4 people who are very well suited and well placed because they lived through it, and many of them served in the government during this time, to help us assess what happened to us on 9/11 and what's happened since. Are we stronger or weaker as a country? Do we face the same threats essentially that we faced on 9/11, or are they different threats? And I'll call them up in just about a minute. But think about this extraordinary last decade. Think about the existential threat that many of us felt then and continue to feel now about the terrorist threat that's worldwide. Think about the 10 years of prosecuting a war against Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The 2 land wars that both of our presidents have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. The change in how we live our lives when we arrive at airports and what happens at airports as we get through to the departure gate. The really tough issues. What do you do with people you find on the battlefield? Issues relating to Guantanamo, issues relating to torture, issues relating to our values and our interests. And finally, think about the wild swing in how we feel about our country and its position in the world, its power, and how others see us. I remember 9/11. I was the American ambassador to NATO. I remember the next morning, our allies in NATO, at that time 18 of them, did something they had never done before in the history of NATO. We invoked Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, an attack on one is attack on all. They invoked it for us. They came to our defense the next morning. And a couple of days later, my wife and I were walking through the medieval city of Louvain in Belgium. We saw a long line outside the city hall of Louvain. Long line of people waiting to get into that city hall to sign a condolence book for the United States of America. And just speed ahead 10 years, we are still popular in some parts of the world, but we're not in every part of the world. Both administrations, Bush and Obama. We were a creditor nation then, we're no longer a creditor nation. We were the undisputed power of the world 10 years ago. We are still the strongest power, but there are other powers rising to compete with us. So it's been an extraordinary decade. And we have 4 great people, and I want to call them up one by one to help us make sense of it. First, I just want to ask Secretary Madeleine Albright to come forward. And our National Security Advisor from late 2004 to early 2009, Steve Hadley. And a friend of mine, Philip Zelikow, who became executive director of the 9/11 Commission, the authoritative commission that investigated 9/11. Philip, please come forward. And last but certainly not least, because she's been an Aspenite and a good friend to all of us, Zoe Baird. if I wanted to give a proper introduction to each of these people, we'd go on for a long time, but you all know that Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State and now is the chairman of Albright Stonebridge, author of many, many books. And Steve Hadley, since he left government, has worked at the U.S. Institute of Peace and also founded a consulting firm, Rice Hadley, and you heard from Rice the other night when we honored Brent Scowcroft. Philip Zelikow is a professor of history at the University of Virginia. He's also the dean, the new dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And as I said, author, executive director of the 9/11 Commission. And Zoe Baird Budinger is the president of the Markle Foundation and a public servant with wide experience in government and in the business sector and in the nonprofit sector. So she's someone who can look at all these issues from a variety of perspectives. We're going to talk for about 25 minutes among us here. I'm going to ask a series of questions to my four friends, and then we're going to turn it over to you, and we'll have microphones, and we want to hear from you. We want to hear your reaction to what we discussed. And the first question I want to ask everybody in the panel is the logical question. Knowing what we know now, it's August 2011, and we're about to commemorate this tragic day, 10th anniversary. What's the lasting impact for Americans of 9/11? Madeleine.
Well, thank you. And before we get serious, I was very glad to be here to honor Brent the other night, but I didn't say what I was going to. And the great part is, in a democracy, we all return to being ordinary people. So there was, after Brent left office and after I left office, we were grocery shopping at the Giant in Rockville. He was in Bermuda shorts, God knows what I had on, and people were looking at us like, are these real people? Did they actually have power? But that is the wonder of our democracy. Let me say, I am a person who believes that 9/11 changed a great deal about America. I was not born in the United States. I was born in Czechoslovakia and spent World War II in England, meaning that, in fact, I was used to being in a vulnerable nation, one that, in fact, was invaded by the Germans and the other which was bombed by the Germans. And so while I was stunned by 9/11, what made me different from my contemporaries, what I'd actually seen, buildings burning. And it did make a difference in the way that I saw what had happened. But what did happen that I think has affected America's psyche is our vulnerability. There we were behind two oceans, fully convinced we were safe, and we were not. And all the things that have happened since 9/11, I think, are very much a part of that loss of confidence in terms of being invulnerable. The invulnerable nation, and I think that that is something that we have to live with. What I find interesting is that everybody knows that I loved being Secretary of State. I did not like it on August 7th, 1998, when our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed. And the question was what to do about it. And you all may not remember, but I certainly do. President Clinton decided to use force and to, in fact, launch cruise missiles against where we thought Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. You may not remember, but I remember. We were very much criticized for that. There were those who thought the whole thing had been made up. And so I think that the way that we look at how we respond to terrorist acts is something that has changed as a result of 9/11. You wanted to know whether we remembered where we were. I actually watched one plane go into the building and then the other one, and then for reasons that are completely unclear to me, I decided I had to go to my office. And the bottom line is, as I was driving there, people said there's potential that there's a bomb outside the State Department. And one of the difficulties about talking about terrorism before 9/11 was that I had to decide to put the Jersey barriers around the State Department and make sure that everybody showed an ID. And people were very critical of me for that. They said I was limiting access, I had changed everything, and all I could think of as I was driving to the office, thank God I had done that. So I do think things have changed. I think that I per se am always very superstitious. If people say, do you think it can happen again? I'm afraid to say that we are in such good shape that it won't, because I guess it's not good for a Secretary of State to be superstitious. But I do think things have changed, and I think many of them for the better, and many of them have affected our psyche.
Thank you. Philip, so you spent a lot of time trying to think about what happened, and then you served in government and had to implement some of the recommendations your commission made. What do you think the lasting impact is?
I actually was asked to write a lot about this for an updated edition of the commission report that's for sale outside, and there are 50 pages of what I think happened over the last 10 years. And I don't want to recap that for you. What I want to do is say this, is that what happens in any period of national crisis, frankly, is like what happens in any period of intense crisis that happens in your lives. Crisis often brings out both our best and our worst. And each of you can reflect over the last 10 years on what illustrations you've seen of both. I've had it because of my experience in government. I've spent a lot of time in our war zones, some time working on intelligence issues, and I've had an opportunity to see see that the crisis has elicited some of the qualities that we as Americans would be most proud of, and some qualities that we're not proud of, and sometimes those same qualities are found in some of the same places. So how should you reflect then on that? Reflect then on the best and the worst of our country that the crisis has revealed to us. You don't have to go back to books about World War II to find out about this generation. Just reflect on the last 10 years. And then think about, how do we learn from that and take it forward? I don't come in from this as someone who's now pessimistic about America or always optimistic about America, but I have seen such impressive qualities that I know that the country has demonstrated the potential for greatness, even in a very tough 10 years, which we didn't want. It's a war that was forced on us. It's had a lot of negative consequences, the most important of which are opportunity costs. All the things we would have paid attention to but didn't because we were paying attention to this. And we can all fill in that list. But in the meantime, do reflect a little bit on what you think you've learned about the best and the worst of our society and carry that forward.
Zoe, your sense of the lasting impact, how have we changed over the last 10 years?
Well, I think focusing on the character of the American people and the psychological impact is actually very appropriate, because I think this country was very unprepared for feeling vulnerable, and I don't think we've responded to it very well. And I think part of the problem has been that we haven't been prepared to look to leaders, something the Aspen Institute focuses on a lot, but we haven't been prepared to look to leaders to help us understand it or to help us move forward. And instead, the place we're left in my judgment, is probably exactly where Osama bin Laden might have hoped we'd be left. We're left in a situation where we're economically weakened, both by wars and by other circumstances that have nothing to do directly with 9/11. We're left in a place where our politics are divided and fierce, and all the insecurities of a country confronted with the shaking of its foundations from 9/11 seem to me to be playing out in the political environment. We're left in a situation where we've declined in our influence in the world. I don't know how much of that is due to our vulnerability, but it certainly may be due to our lack of rising to the threats in the world and the changes in the world with great leadership. And we're left in a position where individuals of all sorts feel that they can attack or undermine our institutions, whether it be terrorists operating on their own or other contexts. So I think that the impact of 9/11 on our national psyche, our individual psyche, our confidence in the American system, our confidence in our leadership, was actually really very profound. I mean, if you do think about where you were on 9/11, you'll remember a lot of the vulnerabilities. I was in Senator Ron Wyden's office when the planes hit, and Jane, you'll remember this. I mean, all the members of Congress were running around saying, what am I supposed to do? people had no idea where they were supposed to go. Nobody had really thought about a circumstance like this before. And yet I don't think we really came together effectively, and I think we're still suffering from that.
I want to ask Steve Hadley to comment on this question, but maybe also transition Steve a little bit further down the line as we got further from 9/11. In addition to what's the lasting impact, what was our government able to do to make us safer? Because I do think the government took significant steps to tighten security, and you were there when that was happening.
Well, it's no doubt that 9/11 has put terrorism probably permanently in our national consciousness and our national agenda. But while we are still not safe, we're a lot safer than we were immediately after 9/11. One thing that's interesting is the dogs that didn't bark after 9/11. The things that everybody anticipated. We thought first 9/11 was going to be the first of a wave of mass casualty attacks. Didn't happen. We thought Al-Qaeda was working on weapons of mass destruction, and we might see chemical, biological, maybe even nuclear threats to the United States. Well, there was an anthrax attack within a month or two after 9/11 that traumatized the nation. We did not see WMD attacks. So a lot of the dogs did not bark. And why? Because the United States really now continued into 2 administrations, made some fundamental changes. We made fundamental changes organizationally, stood up a Department of Homeland Security, made sure that the barrier between intelligence and law enforcement was removed so we could cooperate against threats, told our law enforcement people they needed not only to enforce the law and prosecute, but they had a role in preventing attacks at the United States, stood up Northern Command, made the Treasury part of the war on terror by going after terrorist financing, rallied the international community to help us in a number of different ways, revised our legal structures in order to institutionalize the tools in the war on terror. And as I say, we have now seen those tools move across to 2 administrations, and this administration continuing the fight against terror. So I think the good news is the dogs that did not bark, and a standard we set after 9/11, which was to try to eliminate Al-Qaeda as a threat to our way of life. And I think we've largely succeeded. We've made fundamental changes in how we deal with war and terror, but we have not fundamentally changed at who we are. We still have our freedoms. We still have the openness of our society. And I think that is a tribute. Yes, there are inconveniences every time you go to the airport, but not fundamental changes in who we are in our society. And I think that's a great tribute to our government officials, but I think it's also a great tribute to the resiliency of the American people and how you all responded to this great challenge.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to you for your questions and observations. And the first to Philip and Zoe. I think you're probably best placed to answer this. The 9/11 Commission made some very specific recommendations for how the government should respond to this new threat. And the report of the Commission, the revised report, is outside with a new forward by Philip. I'd encourage you to look at it. Philip and Zoe, has the government, both administrations, President Bush, President Obama, instituted the most important of those recommendations? Is there more that we can do as a government and society to protect our people?
There's a lot of inside the beltway stuff that you can talk about, and Zoe is going to touch on a really important idea that I'll leave off. I just want to leave with you 3 ideas about things we can do to think about making us safer for the long haul. The 3 ideas: just Congress, a learning government, Plan Bs. So first, Congress. The executive branch actually did most of what we recommended. Congress did almost none of what we recommended, because some of what we recommended had to do with changing the congressional committee system. Jane Harmon, who's here, knows this really, really well.
And she's going to get right of response.
I'm not sure she'll disagree with me on this one. So the Congress did a terrific job of legislating rapidly, first right away, and then another piece of legislation more recently that has affected some significant changes, leading among them the National Counterterrorism Center, but many, many other things, including some of the things Steve Hadley's alluded to. So Congress, idea 1. Idea 2, learning organization. A lot of people here and are able to come to a place like Aspen because you've held positions of responsibility, many of them in private life. I think you'll agree with me that the biggest test for an organization is not whether it prevents a bad thing, but how it responds after the bad thing happens. A mature organization learns and adapts after bad things happen. The true measure of whether or not our government's going to be safer, by the way, not just against Al-Qaeda, but against a lot of other kinds of threats that are emerging, say cybersecurity and others that aren't receiving as much attention, but maybe the new things that we're not focusing on as much because of Al-Qaeda. So the key then is whether or not a government learns and adapts as it gets a shock. How well it has the maturity and discipline to examine itself in the aftermath of something where it may look bad. We're not doing as well as I would like as a government in learning how to analyze ourselves in a mature and professional way after each of these events happen, and that's true across both administrations. Third idea, Plan Bs. We can have a long talk about how things are going in Afghanistan and whether our recommendations were followed in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. Let me be more forward-looking than that. Suppose you assume that the heart of the problem are in countries like, say, Pakistan and Yemen. And suppose you also assume that we're not going to invade and occupy either Pakistan or Yemen anytime in the foreseeable future. Suppose you assume then that these places could go bad in ways that we're going to be simply powerless to prevent. That's a possibility. It's a non-trivial possibility. Then the best thing we can do to make ourselves safer is, what's our hedge strategy if that happens? A lot of you have hedging strategies in the management of your own assets. Yeah, you have your plan A if everything goes well in the market, but you have a plan B in case it doesn't. What's our plan B in case our best efforts in Pakistan or Yemen and places like that don't go well? How do we manage places that go bad when we don't want to use the default alternative, well, we'll just flood the zone with American soldiers, an alternative that will be unavailable to us?
Thank you. Zoe.
I want to talk, it's hard to follow Philip, and you're probably sitting there trying to take that all in, but I want to talk just a little bit about an area where our government, where faith has been shattered in so many respects, actually works really effectively and has come to reform itself radically since 9/11, and that's the area of intelligence collection and providing good information to policymakers, and a big part of that is learning to work together differently and share information differently. In the Clinton administration, I served on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and at the time, I was the only person who read the intelligence on Al-Qaeda, and at the time, we thought there were 13,000 Al-Qaeda sympathizers. And we were, I once again just want to remind you, since so much time has passed and your mind is not 10 years ago, but I want to remind you how much we had to adjust. And the intelligence community was not focused on this threat, nor was the FBI, the law enforcement community, the state and local law enforcement. The NYPD did not have an intelligence bureau then. And this government has substantially changed itself in order to collaborate, share information. It led to our being able to ultimately find Osama bin Laden. It led us to be able to prevent the Christmas '09 bombing or explosion. I could go into any details anybody wants on this, but the thing to keep in mind is Jane Harman called this, and we'll keep shouting out Jane, but Jane was a tremendous leader when she was in Congress in this arena, and when we went in and we showed Jane our visualizations of what the world should look like, Philip was then our executive director before the 9/11 Commission was established. And when we showed this to Jane, Jane said, gee, that looks like a virtual reorganization of government. And our government was able to do that. It was able to change. We didn't have to move the boxes. We now have a tremendous capability to understand what's going on in the world, to interact with foreign governments to share information, and at the same time to be able to do all of this while protecting traditional privacy and civil liberties, which was always the phrase that we used in looking at this with the government. So I think this is an area where you should feel that we've made great progress.
Thank you. I have a last question for Madeline and for Steve, and it has to do with, it looks back a little, but it looks forward. It was an unusual decade since 9/11. We fought 2 land wars in the Middle East and South Asia, both difficult, over 2 administrations. What lessons should we learn from both of those looking forward? Because we're surely going to encounter great challenges ahead. And is there a way to think about diplomacy and negotiations and what we do in development, we talked about that the other night, that would balance the military and make us stronger in those first 2 areas and perhaps more effective as a country in a very complicated world?
Well, really following up on what Zoe said, I think that what is important, and diplomacy is very much a basis of this, is we are able to share information with other countries, because we do not have all the information on where a terrorist might be or if somebody actually is a terrorist, and that all comes with diplomacy. I think the thing that is very important, we all wrote a book, so I wrote a book, which was a memo to the president-elect when I had no idea who that person was going to be, and I laid out that there were 5 big umbrella issues that the next president would have to deal with. The first was nuclear proliferation. The second was dealing with terrorism. The third, trying to end the divide between the rich and the poor, not because there is a direct line between terrorists and poverty, but it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to recognize that people that are completely alienated from their societies are more likely to be recruitable. And what we wanted to do was to prevent the worst weapons getting into the hands of the worst people. So there have been diplomatic advances, some in the Bush administration through what is known as the Proliferation Security Initiative, where intelligence is really shared. If there is a ship leaving one port and we find out that it has some kind of nuclear technology, those people that signed it, countries that signed it, are prepared to go after and stop that ship. So diplomacy, I think, is a very important part of this. I also think that we have managed to figure out, I think, in the end, is a balance between diplomacy and force, and also understanding the other activities that have to take place in terms of how you put civilians in, try to develop a way so that these countries have a moment that they can understand that they're part of the system and not outside of it. I think the hardest part, Zoe, you mentioned how many Al-Qaeda people we thought were out there. Clearly, we have taken care of a lot of them through the use of force and through the intelligence. And I think that's the kind of thing where our system has to continue to do that. And the diplomatic tool is the one that I think is going to be the most useful in that.
I think the nation will have little appetite for what we've been through in Afghanistan and Iraq in the future, but I also think there will probably be no need to do it in order to keep the country safe. Al-Qaeda Core, as it's called, has really been buffeted a lot. The death of Osama bin Laden, the disaffection and lack of support in the Islamic world, and now the Arab awakening, which I think is going to undermine Al-Qaeda. I think the kinds of threats we're going to see going forward are affiliated groups in places like Yemen and Somalia and elsewhere. And I think the formula is going to be very different. I think the formula is going to be training, equipping, and supporting local security forces, sharing intelligence with them, providing some kinetic support in terms of manned aircraft and maybe things like Predator, and maybe special forces. But then there is a terribly important civilian component to try to help those governments organize themselves better, perform better, to be able to field effective security forces and win the loyalty of their own people. This is the soft side. This is something that we need civilians. This is something we need private industry. It's something we need NGOs. It's something we need the State Department. And my worry is that as the military piece of the war on terror comes down as we get out of Iraq and Afghanistan at appropriate times, and as we have severe pressure on our budgets and rightful concern about the deficits, we will have a tendency to cut the soft side and preserve the hard side. And I hope we hear from Leon Panetta what we heard from Bob Gates, which was he put such priority on the civilian partner of the military that he at one point said, I'm willing to send DoD money over to the State Department because we, the military, need them to be better financed for their mission. I think that's the world in which we're heading, and I hope Leon Panetta has the same attitude.
I will say, and I want to give Madeline the last word here, as a former diplomat, Bob Gates said, there are still more lawyers in the Pentagon than American diplomats, and there are more members of the armed forces marching bands, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, than American diplomats, which is the perfect segue to Madeline.
But let me just say, to put together the answer that I gave to your first question in this is, we are more vulnerable, and we are concerned about our economy, and we're concerned about, you know, who are our friends and who aren't inside, and is every Muslim a terrorist, and those things. And for me, I think it shows that what has to happen is that we cannot pull up the moat because we're vulnerable and decide that we only care about ourselves, because what is out there, go back to my umbrella issues, no matter how strong the United States is, we can't deal with those alone. So I think the subject of discussion and the budget is, how do we make sure that we are protected, that America's interests are followed out, and yet that we do not decide that we have to only worry about ourselves, because if we only worry about ourselves, we will be more vulnerable.
Thank you. And thanks to our four panelists. I want to go to all of you now, and I think I'd be remiss in not saying she's seated right in front of me, that former Congresswoman Jane Harman is here. She just received from Brent Scowcroft and Joe and I the other night the Leadership Award of the Aspen Strategy Group, and Jane, you deserved it, so congratulations for that. Questions? We have a mic right here and there. Yes, right in the middle, right here.
Hi. Thank you. That's a lot. On the heels of what Mr. Hadley and Secretary Albright said, on the one hand, that we have to work with foreign governments and foreign nations cooperating with them to ensure that the people of the country are supporting the military and you know, as a unified force, you know, working against these threatening forces. And then on the other hand, this sort of rift between the have and the have-nots. I'm just wondering what the thinking, I live in Kenya, I should explain. I live in Nairobi, Kenya. And the kind of things that we're seeing now, especially in light of what's happened in North Africa, I find chilling. The rift between the have and the have-nots is just growing enormously. And I see that the vulnerability of the people and the focus of the people is sort of, well, you know, where's my next bowl of maize or rice or unga coming from? So as you mentioned, Secretary Albright. So anyway, trying to, you know, put these things together. What are the great minds thinking? What is the government thinking in terms of really, because the reality is, you know, in Kenya with corruption, with
could I just ask,
I'm
is
sorry.
there a specific question
yes.
you want to ask?
What are the great minds thinking about really trying to address, what's the interplay between this huge rift between the have and the have-nots and this reality of, you know, national security? How does, sorry to ramble, but it's a lot of information.
Thank you for your question. Yeah. It's an important question.
Well, I think it's a very hard question and an even harder one to answer, because I think that I have always thought of the United States as a very generous nation, and that we do want to see some way of mitigating what we see. And what's happened is, with the media, we know what's going on in these countries. We can see the famine in Somalia, for instance, massive. And I think the question comes down to how we deal with what our political situation is at the moment, where I think people really felt that we have no money, which is a little hard to imagine sitting here. And the other is what is happening to the people everywhere else. And our political situation, the home front, and what is necessary abroad is directly linked, which is where you all come in. And I think that is one of the subjects that we all need to talk about. To what extent do we see it is in our national interest to be able to make sure that people somewhere are not starving, or that they're not killing each other because they are involved in corruption and things? They're great minds. I don't know. Jane, you talk about a cell deficit, brain cell deficit. So, you know, I do think that those are the major issues out there. Americans, I have said this, are the most generous people in the world with the shortest attention span. And these problems are very long duration.
And let me just add to this. Surely it's an American obligation to reach out to the poor around the world, the less fortunate, but that's not solely an American obligation. I'm just looking at Steve. I mean, one of the lessons, surely, of the last 10 years and increased globalization is we cannot go it alone. We can't be isolationist or unilateralist. We've got to engage with allies, but I think there's been a lot of progress in building those coalitions.
I think that's right. There has been progress, but I think the real problem we have is there is a lack of governmental capacity in the world today if you compare it to the pressures governments are under, whether it is transnational terrorism, whether it is drug trafficking, whether it is organized crime. There is enormous pressure and resources and capability in the hands of the bad guys that is really overwhelming a lot of these governments. These are governments that are not strong. Many of them are not democratic. They do not have strong support among their own people. They're riven by corruption. So the real trick and the real lack is how do we and our allies work to strengthen the capacity of governments, to make them more responsive, to make them less corrupt, to make them able to provide a better life for their people and address the kind of gap between rich and poor you're talking about. That is the real challenge. And we really, you know, I say so many times, we've spent 60 years developing a terrific military. We have not made the similar investment in the kind of civilian capabilities we need to help countries be able to deal with the kind of challenges they face today.
Philip, final thought on this?
Well, the Aspen Institute sponsored another group last week that was focused on these very problems you've raised. I agree with and by the way, a number of people were there from Africa, from Asia, including the head of the African Development Bank. You would have been very heartened by the conversation. I first agree with everything Steve Hadley said, but I'd say that this is not about foreign aid. That's not the dominant narrative of the story. The dominant narrative is what these countries decide to do and how they govern themselves and look for success, and their ability to attract the world's money, mainly in the private sector, some fraction of the $96 trillion currently in foreign investment assets. That's not hot money. That's actually invested money. That's changed 1,000% in the last 20 years. And by the way, the Africans have already figured this out, and they're already moving in that direction. That's how most stuff gets paid for. What then is the role of foreign aid? It's in things the market won't do. It's in things, let me give two examples. Global health, public health, where we've seen huge gains. It works. And second, technology. Key technologies that the market won't necessarily supply and invent, the green revolution, a famous illustration. There are other remarkable breakthroughs being done right now in vaccines, for example, that would really hearten you, but there you can't rely on the market. That's where you do need enough support to keep those core programs alive, even during a period of budget austerity.
Thank you very much. Yes, right back here. Right back there. Thank you.
Hi, excuse me. As I'm sure you're all aware, biotech is advancing quite quickly, in many ways faster than IT. The cost of sequencing a genome is falling by about an order of magnitude a year. And I was just wondering if you think that, whereas perhaps 10 years ago you might need funds on the scale of a great state to create you know, a harmful microbe, you know, in a few years it might be more on the scale of an individual's income. And I was just wondering if what the four of you think as far as small-scale biotech potentially being the next front in the war on terror. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to take this question? Zoe? Do you want to? Zoe?
I'll take the question. You know, I think that is a viable threat. I think, though, that we don't need anything so fancy, that we have easy potential now for chemical weapons. For example, in the state of New York, when there's a blackout, everybody's required to exit the building and go out into the street. How easy it would be to use a chemical weapon and wipe out the whole city of Manhattan. But those things need to be stopped, not scientifically, but by our having a good understanding of who would want to do us harm and preventing these events through the use of good intelligence, information, and having a good response. In the bio area, a lot of people believe that you can never get ahead of all the agents and that you need to have a good public health response, and that's where most of the effort's been put in that arena. And to date, it's probably adequate, but you know, you're certainly right to say that we're not going to be able to get ahead of everything. But you can imagine all kinds of scenarios of what the threat will be and how it will happen. And we've actually been remarkably able, through the cooperation of a father who is afraid of what his son might do, or a neighbor who wonders what's going on in the next building. And fortunately, our police and FBI have been very careful of privacy and civil liberties to date in responding to those things, and we haven't had a nation in uproar either, because we don't like the police state that's being created. But all these things are things we have to be attentive to, so it's important that you're all sitting here and worrying about them.
Thank you very much. Yes, over here. Yes, sir.
Hello. My name is John Frank. I work for a company called Nixle, and one of the things that we do is we provide a product that law enforcement and other government agencies use to communicate with citizens via cell phone and email and the web. And we also have a product that allows government agencies to do intercommunication. In fact, our technology was used at the G20 to coordinate all the different law enforcement agencies that were working. I believe it was in Pittsburgh. One of the things that I recall that came out of 9/11 was it was one of the lack of communication between different local agencies, such as the New York Fire Department and the New York Police Department, caused some problems. That they were, you know, they all have different technologies. I was curious. I know we touched on what's being done at the federal level, the national level, with agencies being able to communicate. But I was hoping to get some thoughts on what's also being done at the local level to allow communication, which is especially needed in case of an emergency.
Thank you very much. Philip.
Two dimensions to this. One is getting a good incident command system set up that you exercise and practice. A lot of lessons have been learned from 9/11 about this and are being applied with some success. We now have a national incident management strategy. By the way, there was a neat article in the New Yorker about the incident management of the Gulf oil spill that actually, on the process side, displayed some remarkable strengths. Another dimension to this, which you may know a lot about, has to do with the allocation of spectrum to public responders, to public agencies to use, to basically give them a dedicated part of the broadcast spectrum. This is such a complex issue, I do not understand it. Here's what I understand. I understand that actually developing the technology to utilize this part of the spectrum is extremely expensive, much more expensive than the government's going to be able to afford to pay. You cannot ask the private sector to then build all the infrastructure to use that spectrum and say, thank you very much, and we will now take it all away from you. So therefore, you need to figure out some method by which you incentivize the private sector to build that infrastructure, which will cost many billions of dollars, but then be able to share it with emergency agencies when needed.
Thank you very much. Yes, right over here in the front, right? Second row. Right there. Third row, excuse me.
Hi, okay, so moving far from the home front, and I have a question about Pakistan in particular. It seems like since May, since Osama's death, that our relationship with Pakistan is souring really quickly. And our announcement that we were going to have cuts with our military aid, and then Pakistan's response that they're going to pull troops from the border. And also with our increased use of drones in the area, it seems that, you know, things are not looking up. And since Pakistan, with obviously with intelligence and as a key ally, but also with the gap between haves and have-nots, I'm wondering what your perspective is on that, and also as you look to the future with withdrawing from Afghanistan, how that might look.
Thank you. I think Madeline Steve might have something to say about this.
Well, Pakistan has everything that gives you an international migraine. You know, it has nuclear weapons, terrorism, poverty, corruption, a weak government, and it's in a bad location. So I think on any given day, if you were
Is there
gonna,
anything good you can
no,
say?
well, but I think on any given day, if there were a discussion in the government about what is the most dangerous place that we have to deal with, I think most of the votes would go to Pakistan. And very, very complicated. I think that this is exactly, though, the kind of thing where Nick talked about diplomacy. I think that is going to be a major tool for the use with Pakistan, because part of what is going on here is that they think that we're not dealing with them on a equal level. Let me just say, this is unbelievably difficult, and all of us have dealt with it in some form or another, and it doesn't get better. But I do think that the diplomatic tool is a very important one. The question is whether you condition assistance that you give to them. The Senate has passed a bill, Kerry-Lugar bill, which is supposed to give money to Pakistan in the economic field, but it's conditioned on a lot of their behavior. We don't have a lot of good tools to deal with Pakistan, frankly. And I think that we do have to spend an inordinate amount of time on it. They are very important to us. They are going to make life very difficult for us for a good long time, but I think it is the most difficult problem out there, and we need to look at the various tools available, especially as we pull out of Afghanistan. But I don't think anybody has a permanent answer to Pakistan. We have gone through many ups and downs with them, which is part of the problem. They talk about a deficit in trust with each other because we change policies, and it's a very tough one. I think it's the hardest question anybody could ask, even harder than about genomes, which I couldn't answer at all.
And Steve, could I add to the complexity? This is a really good question. Is if it's reasonable to assume that some members of the Pakistani government knew that Osama bin Laden was where he was for 5 years, should we just cut off assistance, walk away, or do we still do the hard thing and engage because we have no alternative? That's a tough question.
I think there's no alternative to engage. Pakistan is one of these countries that is both an ally in the war on terror, a safe haven for terrorists, and a country that gives material support to terrorists. That's the stew. It's incredibly important to us because a Pakistan that becomes a failed state or a terrorist-controlled state really risks the stability and security of South Asia. So, second, Pakistan has a long list of legitimate grievances with us. We abandoned them in the 1980s, cut off ties because of nuclear issues. They would say, I think, with some justice, that we don't express enough appreciation of the contribution they've made in the war on terror, the Al-Qaeda they have killed, and the civilians and military they have lost. And finally, as Ambassador Haqqani, their ambassador to the United States, will tell you, we don't listen to them. That is their view. There are two hopeful things. One, it is a democratic government. It is a democratic government. We made a transition from authoritarianism under Musharraf to a weak but nonetheless democratic government that we can work with. Second of all, that government has now concluded that the terrorists they have harbored in the past are now potentially a strategic threat to Pakistan. And third, I think they've come to the conclusion that they need to cooperate with us because they need a settlement in Afghanistan that can protect their interests, but eliminates Afghanistan as a potential terrorist threat to Pakistan. There is a potential for commonality. It's a difficult relationship. We are going to just have to work it. But walking away is not the way to protect our interests.
Does everybody in the panel agree with that?
Have a plan B.
Zoe? Okay.
I agree. I think, unfortunately, over the last 20 years, the situation has deteriorated. We didn't face it early enough, effectively enough.
And Philip, what is the plan B?
Let me say one thing. I always say,
Give them time to think.
you have a plan A. Plan B is always make plan A work. And somewhere there is a plan C. So Philip, what is plan C?
By the way, well, you have to have a policy that says if we can't control what's going to happen in this country, how do we quarantine, contain, and neutralize what can happen there? And by the way, if you have visible preparations to quarantine, contain, and neutralize, that actually improves your odds for plan A.
Okay. He has a plan B. We have 5 minutes left, but I'm going to ask for special dispensation that maybe we take this another 10 minutes, not 5, because we've got a lot of people who want to ask questions. And right here, yes, sir.
The diplomatic effort seems to be the most important effort that we're doing, and I so support you in calling on Congress to give you more finances to actually do that. I think that's the answer. At the same time, what I see across the world, including in this own country, is the absolute frustration of ordinary people with governments, including our own. Recently, I saw a poll that said that 77% of the population in the United States considered Congress to be inept, incompetent. Even the word stupid was used many, many times, that they simply seem to lack the courage to handle what needs to be handled. They seem to be more worried about their re-election than they are actually handling these incredible problems that we have right now. Please, any intelligent commentary about that would be greatly appreciated.
Jane, Jane, do you want to stand up? Would you mind? Thanks.
Is this working? Yes. I appreciate all the praise, but I don't. Is it working? This is a Harman system in America. I am a recovering politician. I think most of you know I just left after 9. Okay, I just left Congress after 9 terms. I think the diagnosis is right. I have a piece in Newsweek this weekend called Escape from the Asylum. And the paradigm in Congress now is to blame the other guy for not solving the problem rather than to work with him or her to solve it. Because if you do that, the other person might get credit and then might get reelected. So you are right. What to do about it, very briefly, is 3 things, I think. I hope our president reaches for the frustrated core in Congress. There are lots of good people in both parties in Congress who want to solve problems. They're just prevented from doing it by this paradigm. And if President Obama reaches for these people and empowers them, I think that would be very helpful. The second thing is there needs to be competitive congressional districts. We should change the way districts are drawn so that people have to fight it out. And if you have to run for re-election and win against other people, you learn how to work with them and how to build a bigger tent, and that's a good way to solve problems. And the final thing is, the middle has to be militant. I think the middle is sitting in this room, and you have to make this a big deal, and you have to reward the people who compromise and take the risks to solve problems, and you have to punish the people who are shrill and operate at the margins. It's really up to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go right over here. Yes. And thanks to Jane.
So 9/11 cost $100,000 to pull off. Was our decade-long war response appropriate?
9/11 cost $100,000 to pull off. Was our decade-long response appropriate to it? Steve?
I would say yes, and it's because of all those dogs that didn't bark, and because of the fact that we continue to function as an open, free society. That is the benefit of the response to 9/11. The cost effectiveness is troubling, and I'll give you an example. It costs even less to make an IAD that can destroy conventional military vehicles. It costs probably $1.5 million of a copy to give an MRAP vehicle, which gives as much protection to our troops against an IED, an improvised explosive device, as you can. On cost effectiveness terms, it's ludicrous, but we do it to protect our men and women in uniform so that they can carry the fight against the terrorists and can keep us safe. So yes, the cost effectiveness trades and the war on terror are all in the side of the terrorists, but the investment we have made to protect our way of life here at home has been worth it.
So,
I guess I heard the question a little bit differently, and I would say the answer to the question I heard is a lot more complicated. I think the question I heard was, has this country spent its money wisely in fighting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? And I think we spent much too much, and we couldn't afford it. And Steve and I have disagreed over this for a long time. I think that this country had other more proportional responses that would not have left us with the financial problems that we have now, and that we made a lot of mistakes. I do think that there are a lot of low-cost things, much lower-cost things we've done that have been hugely important, as I've said, and I think that there are many more things that we need to continue to do. Obviously, if we have troops out there, we have to protect them. I think the issue is a lot more complicated, Steve, with all due respect.
Boy, do I hate measuring this in money. I've spent time at 9/11 memorials. I do not measure the cost-effectiveness trade in money. And by the way, neither do the terrorists. Because if you try to ask yourself, what life expectancy does an Al-Qaeda leader think he now has in Pakistan or Iraq? It's probably measured in weeks, not months. That's also part of their cost-effectiveness analysis.
I can't help but get into this, but let me just say the following thing. I think that there are many ways to second guess what has happened in the last 10 years, and I am more than prepared to do that. I think the issues are we have to figure out, and I agree, this is not a dollar for dollar amount. The question is whether we have used the last 10 years in the best possible way in order to do what we talked about in the beginning, to protect America, to have a sense that we are the country, I have always said, the indispensable nation, the one that is really there to be a beacon and to be able to lead the world. I think there are many things that have gone wrong. I personally would not have gone into Iraq, and I would have done something different about Afghanistan. But I think what troubles me is what things have happened in the last 10 years that have complicated things. A number of people here have talked about the war on terror. I think that is a bad term because the people that attacked us on 9/11 were murderers, plain and simple. And when we talk about a war on terror, these murderers develop a different kind of reputation within their own societies. They become warriors on behalf of some creed, and that was the mistake, I think. I think we have to realize that terrorism, as Steve said, is something that is going to be in our lives. The question is whether the decisions made in the last 10 years have helped us. I do think we're safer. I think our problem now is to look forward and try to figure out how, with less money, as we've all said, a very divided society, we are able to figure out how to make the next 10 years better. And I think we all need to be involved in it. And I so agree with Jane. People say they're not moderates. I am a passionate moderate, and we have to get out there and talk as much as those who do not agree.
So we scheduled this until 7:30. It's 7:32. One final question. We're going to have to leave the stage, but I can see lots of hands up. We'll have to come back next year. and have the same conversation. Yes, sir.
Stefan Edlis, a simple question back to basics. You described the team, what happened 10 years after 9/11. There was a description about the defense and a description about the offense in the last 10 years. It seems to me that the defense gets very high marks. Everyone agrees that we're slightly safer. What marks would you give yourself for the offense on a scale from 1 to 10?
Fair enough. Fair enough. And why don't we use this to answer this question and your final words to this audience on this issue?
I think there were actually two elements of the response to 9/11, and I think they were interactive. One was all the things we talked about and the 9/11 Commission talked about hardening our the homeland and increasing our capacity in terms of intelligence and all the rest to go after the war on terror. But I think a terribly important piece was that we did recognize that it was a war on terror, that the United States was attacked on 11. It was what we call a decapitating attack. They went after our financial center in New York. They went after the Pentagon, the center of our military, and that third plane that a bunch of heroes prevented from coming to Washington was going either at the Capitol or at the White House. This was a group of people that had declared war on us. They called it jihad. They called it a holy war. We didn't create that. They did. And I think the other piece of our response was the offensive piece, where we went after Afghanistan. We asked the Taliban, we tried to avoid war, we asked the Taliban to close down the training camps, expel Al-Qaeda, turn over the leadership, and they would not do it. And so the president went in and denied Al-Qaeda a safe haven from which they could train, plan attacks, and prepare weapons of mass destruction, which we knew they were working on. And the result of it, we have had Al-Qaeda Core on the run for 10 years, and that's one of the major reasons that those terrible scenarios we envisioned after 9/11 did not occur.
Zoe?
I think we can't overstate the terrible thing that happened on 9/11, whether it's the World Trade Center or seeing the hole in the side of the Pentagon. We can't overstate the loss to the families and to our own confidence. But I would not give us strong marks on the offensive, because the offensive didn't build our national character, and that's what we need to do now.
Philip.
I already alluded to a crisis bringing out the best and the worst in a society, and I don't think I need to elaborate more on that. I'll say this. Before 9/11, we had a paradox of prevention. The paradox of prevention is that it's really hard to mobilize hard action against a threat until folks can see it, and then it's too late. The paradox of prevention is gone. Actually, we now have that paradox on some other problems. What's replaced it is a paradox of adjustment. Suppose the threat isn't as great, and you want to right-size it so you can normalize it, but you're afraid to do it. You're afraid to do it because if you make a speech normalizing it, the president could be humiliated by the attack the next day. You're afraid to do it because you're afraid of dulling the edge of alertness and inducing complacency. In other words, you can't say a threat isn't as risky because it would be too risky to say so. That's the paradox of adjustment. That's the paradox we're in now. It's a test of our maturity as a society then, for us to come to live with the fact that our systems, our society, is threatened from a lot of different sources, and we need to pay attention to all of those things and normalize and build systems that are resilient to handle that. We need to help our elected officials, whatever we may think of their system, cope with the paradox of adjustment.
Thank you. Madeline?
I have to say, this is the first of many events that I'm already scheduled to do to talk about 9/11 and the 10th anniversary of it, and I think it's given me a lot to think about. I think what is important is to realize that the people who make decisions have a very, very hard job. There's nothing easier than ex post facto 20/20 hindsight. And so I try to be very careful in making judgments about how decisions were made. There's a lot about the last 10 years that I think was wrong, a lot of things that I think went very well, and that there are a lot of more people in the world that are part of a political system that are able to speak out, that have a sense that they have a right to their dignity. And the United States has a lot to do with it. It's not all our story, but our example has been very important. I do think that we have to look at the 9/11 anniversary in a way that allows us to move forward, because we are in a very complicated period. I have often, or recently, been talking about the difference in international relations. During the Cold War, it was like two ships in the Panama Canal. Not a lot of room on either side in terms of the direction that we were going. After the end of the Cold War, it was like ships in the English Channel. More water, but still land on either side. We are now in the middle of the ocean with a lot more ships and storms, and I think that what we need to do is to look at the 9/11 anniversary as a time to look at what the character of the American people are and not be ruled by the fear factor. We cannot look at the person sitting next to us and wonder who that person is, or what religion that person is, or what economic status they have. We need to look at ourselves again as I'm a naturalized American. And people have asked me what is the most important thing that ever happened to me, becoming an American, hands down. And so I think we have to take this anniversary and look at what is the best in us and make sure that we understand that we need the rest of the world in order to be the best.
Wonderful. I'm sorry we have to end this discussion because I know a lot of you wanted to participate. I'd just say one last thing. This is going to be a time of reflection for us, and we have to look back self-critically. But I like what a lot of you said at the end. We've got to look forward, and hopefully in a bipartisan fashion, to correct whatever mistakes we made, but to go forward with confidence. Thank you to all of you. It was a great panel. Thanks very much.